ductus, nuclei, and the tracts. Okay, so basically we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and the parts of the central nervous system basically involves the brain and the spinal cord. So today we are going to discuss about the spinal cord. So what is spinal cord basically? Spinal cord, it's a long cylindrical lower part of the central nervous system. Okay, so it's the lower part of the central nervous system, and it occupies the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal, and it is enclosed by the three meninges. So we know that we have three meninges basically covering the brain as well as the spinal cord, and these three meninges, they are also covering the spinal cord also. Okay, and it has 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and it retains a basic structural pattern. Okay, so spinal cord is a long cylindrical lower part of the central nervous system. It's enclosed within the vertebral canal, only in the upper 2/3 of the vertebral canal. Okay, so what are the features of spinal cord? The features of spinal cord, that is, what's the length of spinal cord? It is about 45 centimeters in case of adult male and about 42 centimeters in females, and it is surrounded by the three meninges, but there is a slight difference in the meningeal covering of the brain and the spinal cord that we'll discuss later. And usually it extends from the upper border of the atlas vertebra. Atlas vertebra means the first cervical vertebra, that's the atlas vertebra, to the lower border of the first lumbar, that's the L1 vertebra in an adult. And in children, it extends up to the L3 vertebra. And superiorly, it is continuous with the medulla oblongata, and inferiorly, it terminates as a conus medullaris. So here we have to notice one point. That is, usually the spinal cord is contained only up to the 2/3 of the vertebral column. But in the intrauterine life, up to the 3rd month of intrauterine life, what happens is that the vertebral length of the spinal cord is occupying almost whole of the vertebral column. When after birth and in children, the termination of the spinal cord is occurring at the L3, that is lumbar 3 vertebra. And in adults, it is occurring in the lower border of the L1 vertebra, or between the L1 and L2. It is terminating. The spinal cord is terminating at the level of L1 and L2, or the lower border of the L1 vertebra. That's about the extension of the spinal cord inside the vertebral canal. So this is basically the vertebra, typical vertebra containing the spinal cord, and it is covered by the three meninges. Okay. Inside we have outermost we have the dura mater, and beneath that we have the arachnoid, and inside that is in intimate relationship with the spinal cord is the pia mater. Okay. So as the spinal cord is much shorter, as I've already mentioned, the spinal cord is much shorter than when compared to the length of the vertebral column. The spinal segments do not lie opposite to the corresponding vertebrae. So spinal segments is not in correlation with the corresponding vertebrae. And in estimating the position of the spinal segment in relation to the surface of the body, it is important to remember that the vertical spine is always at a lower position when compared to the corresponding spinal segment. Spinal segment is means it's a part of the spinal cord which is enclosing the two right and left spinal nerves. Okay. Single nerve is enclosed by a single spinal segment. Okay. So these are the level of vertebrae and the spinal segments. Since the spinal cord is extending up to L1 vertebrae, this difference is occurring. So in the vertebral levels of C1 to C7, that's a 7 cervical vertebrae are there, and 8 spinal nerves are there. So C1 to C8 is enclosed within the C1 to C7 vertebral levels, and from the thoracic region, that is from 1 to 6, the spinal segments 1 to 8 is enclosed. Okay, from T7 to T9, T10 to T12 spinal segments are. That is, the spinal segments are congested because of the small length of the spinal cord. This is the vertebral levels corresponding and the corresponding spinal segments. Okay, this is due to the disharmony of the length of the spinal cord and the vertebral column. Okay, so we have 8 spinal nerves in relation to the cervical region, and 12 thoracic roots are there, and that is somewhat extending downward. Okay, this is the spinal cord. Its extension is up to L1 vertebrae. Okay, this is the 12 pairs of spinal nerves in association with the thoracic region, and lumbar roots, that's also 5. Sacral roots is 5, and coccygeal root is only 1. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, that is 8 pairs of cervical part, 8 in cervical part, 12 in the thoracic part, 5 in the lumbar part, 5 in the sacral part, and 1 coccygeal area. Okay, so that is in correspondence with this types of these levels because of the disharmony in the length of the spinal cord and the vertebral canal. Now coming to the meningeal coverings. As I already mentioned, brain is also covered by 3 meninges and the spinal cord is also covered by the 3 meninges. Okay. And the outermost is the dura mater, the middle one. Beneath that, we can see the arachnoid. That's an avascular or non-nervous thin membrane. Okay. That's the arachnoid matter. And the innermost is the pia mater. Pia means something that is very soft. Okay. That's somewhat protective in nature. And the space between the dura mater and arachnoid matter is called the subdural space. And the arachnoid and the pia maters are separated by the subarachnoid space, which is containing the cerebrospinal fluid. And the spinal cord, it extends on the lower part of the, as I have already mentioned, it extends in the lower part of the, it extends up to the lower part of the first lumbar, that is L1 vertebrae. And the lower part of the spinal cord as such is called conus medullaris. Okay, so the lower part of the spinal cord is called conus medullaris. And below the level of conus medullaris, only pia mater is continued as a thin fibrous cord. That is what we call as phylum terminal. Okay. Okay. And usually we have the dura. Dura is composing of 2 membranes. The outermost, that is in intimate relationship with the cranial wall. That is what we call as endosteal layer of the dura mater. And that is associated with the soft tissue. That is the brain or the spinal cord, whatever it is. It is called the meningeal layer. So 2 layers are there for the dura mater, outer endosteal layer and a meningeal layer. That is in association with the soft tissue. So in case of spinal cord, in contrast to the brain, the dura mater is having only the meningeal layer in relation to the spinal cord. So there will be a potential space in between the vertebral canal and the meningeal layer of the dura mater. Since that is bound by the endosteal layer in case of brain, whereas in spinal cord, the endosteal layer is absent. So there is a space that is extending between the vertebral canal and the meningeal layer of the dura mater or the outermost layer of the dura mater. So that space is called epidural space. Epi means something that is situated outward. So the space between that's vertebral column or the bone, inside bone and the meningeal layer of the dura mater, there is a space that is called the epidural space. So the space between the meningeal layer and the endosteum of the vertebral canal, it is called the epidural space. There is a clinical importance. We have the epidural anesthesia is given into this space. Okay. And also there is some modification that is occurring in the innermost meningeal layer, that is the pia mater. What's the modification? There are actually 4 modifications are there. One is the one we have already mentioned, that is the phylum terminal. That's the extension of the pia mater. The spinal cord is terminating at the L1 level, but the pia mater is not. Pia mater is in close association with the spinal cord, but it is extending to the coccygeal region or the coccygeal bone as a thin cord-like structure, fibrous cord-like structure. That is what we call as phylum terminal. Okay, so phylum terminal, it's a modification of the pia mater. And next is the ligamentum denticulate. It has 21 pairs of teeth-like projection which keep the spinal cord in position. Okay, so we know that the spinal nerve has 2 roots, a posterior root. The spinal cord, you can imagine it as a man facing you. Okay, so this is the left side and this is the right side. This is the anterior part and this is the posterior part. Okay, so the spinal nerve is having 2 roots. The posterior root is purely sensory. That's a dorsal. This part is always called, posterior part is always called dorsal part, and this is the ventral part. So there is a dorsal root or the posterior root, and there is a ventral or the anterior root. That is purely motor. Okay, these roots are pure. That is, roots are posterior root is sensory, pure sensory. Only sensory nerve fibers are passing through that particular nerve root. And here in the anterior nerve root is purely motor. And this together join to form the trunk of the spinal nerve. Okay. So in between this, like this, okay, in between the anterior and the posterior roots, this pia mater is extending and it is piercing the dura mater and is anchoring to the dura mater. That is what we call as, this is about 21 pairs are there for the ligamentum denticulate. They are tooth-like extensions of the pia mater. So it's a modification of the pia mater. What's the function of this modification? It anchors the spinal cord in its position. Okay. And another one is the linea splendens, which is seen in the anterior part. This is the anterior part of the spinal cord. It's a thickening seen at the thickening of the pia mater seen in the anteromedian sulcus is called. This is the anteromedian sulcus. It is called the linea splendens. And subarachnoid septum is another modification that is seen in the posterior part. Okay. So that's about the meningeal layers. Okay. So this phylum terminal, that's a modification of the pia mater. It is about 20 centimeter long, and after leaving through the sacral hiatus, it ends by getting attached to the periosteum of the dorsal. That's its extension. It is getting attached to the periosteum of the dorsal surface of the first segment of the coccyx. Okay, coccyx is the last terminal vertebrae. Okay, there are 4 coccygeal bones are there. Okay, so this meninges is not terminating at the particular level as that of the spinal cord, and spinal cord is terminating in the L1 level, but the meninges are not terminating in the L1 level. And the dura and the arachnoid, they together along with the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space usually contains a CSF. Okay, it extends up to the second sacral vertebra. It extends up to the second S2 vertebra, whereas the pia mater is extending till the coccyx region. Okay. So between the lower border of the L1 is the termination of spinal cord, and S2 vertebrae, the subarachnoid space contains only spinal nerve roots. Okay, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Okay, so in order to accommodate that, these nerve roots are passing beyond the L1 region. That is, even after the termination of the spinal cord, these nerve roots are traversing as vertical structures. They are together known as coda equina. Okay, due to its means a resemblance to the horse tail. Okay, so between the lower border of the L1 and S2 vertebra, the subarachnoid space, they contain the spinal nerve roots which constitute the coda equina. And due to this feature, the lumbar puncture is done below the L2 vertebra. That is, beyond the level of L2, we have only the nerve roots and not the spinal cord. So that particular part is called lumbar cistern. Lumbar cistern. It's ideal. It's an ideal structure for the execution of lumbar puncture. Lumbar puncture we use to collect the CSF and examine for the bacteria in case of meningitis, etc. Okay. In case of meningitis, we have to culture the CSF and find the which bacteria is there, and accordingly the medicine prescriptions can be made. So lumbar puncture is usually done below the level of L3 vertebra in adults, whereas in children it is done below the L3 because the termination of spinal cord in children is about below the level of L3 vertebra. Okay, so that is what that's about lumbar cistern and lumbar puncture. Okay. Now coming to the enlargements of the spinal cord. Normally, the spinal cord is having a diameter of about 1.2 to 1.25 throughout the vertebral, throughout the spinal cord, almost the same thickness is there. But certain areas, there are enlargements occurring to the spinal cord in order to accommodate certain additional neuronal plexus. Okay. So, basically, in order to accommodate the limbs, at the limb areas, there are brachial plexus, lumbosacral plexus, etc. are there. In order to accommodate that, at that particular portions, there are enlargements that is happening to the spinal cord. Okay, so limbs are the appendages of the trunk, and their muscles have to be supplied by the neurons of the spinal cord. So the neurons at appropriate level forms enlargements to be able to supply the increased or additional musculature. And spinal cord, it presents the cervical enlargement for the supply of upper, that is containing the branchial plexus of nerves. So the cervical enlargement is there. This cervical enlargement extends from the C4 to T1 spinal segments, and the maximum diameter, it is occurring at the C6 segment. Okay. Another enlargement is there, that is in the lumbosacral region. Okay, beneath to, in order to accommodate the lumbosacral plexus to supply the lower limbs. And usually it extends from the level of L2 to S3, that is sacral third vertebra segments, and its maximum diameter is at the level of S1, that is first sacral vertebral level, the maximum diameter. So there are two enlargements in the cervical region as well as in the lumbosacral region in order to accommodate the additional nerve supply to the limbs. Okay, that's the importance of the enlargements of the spinal cord. This has many clinical implications. Okay. So this is the cervical enlargement, that is from the level C3 to T2. Okay, and the lumbar enlargement is seen in relation to the L1 to S3. And there is a sacral enlargement from S1 to S5 region. Okay. Now coming to the coda equina that I have already mentioned. That is, the nerve roots are extending beyond the level of L1 vertebrae, even after the termination of the spinal cord. That resembles a tail of the horse. That's why it is called coda equina. Okay, and the dorsal and ventral nerve roots of the right and left sides of L2 to L5, and these are all the vertebral numbers. Okay, L1 means L means lumbar. Okay, S means sacral. 1 to 5, and CO means coccygeal region. CO1 nerves lie almost vertically around the phylum terminal, and these are called coda equina, as these resemble a horse's tail. Okay, and dorsal and ventral nerve roots of one segment join together at the respective intervertebral foramen to exit as a spinal. I have already mentioned that spinal nerve consists of two roots, that is the dorsal root and ventral root. This is occurring on the one side, and on the other side, that is opposite side, is also having the dorsal and ventral. So there are four roots for a particular spinal nerve, and a spinal segment is containing four roots. Okay. So each segment is having four nerve roots. On the right and left side combined, there are four nerve roots, two dorsal and two ventral nerve roots. And thus there are 4 into 4, that is 16. From L2 to L5 is 4. Okay. So 4 into 4 nerve roots, that is 16 lumbar nerve roots are there. And sacral region, we have 5 vertebrae, into 4, that is 20 sacral nerve roots, and coccygeal region only one spinal nerve is traversing. So 4 into 1, that is 4 coccygeal nerve roots are there. So it together makes the 40 nerve roots are passing downwards as the coda equina. Okay. And one dorsal root and one ventral root, it joins to form one spinal nerve, and it leaves through the foramen on one side. Okay. So at every intervertebral foramen, 4 nerve roots exit the coda equina, and beneath, coming downwards, it becomes thinner and thinner. In the end, only phylum terminal. So even after the nerve root termination, this phylum terminal is extending to anchor into the coccygeal region. So in the end, only that is this nerve roots, the population of the nerve roots is becoming thinner and thinner as it approaches the coccygeal vertebrae. Okay. So that is what we call as coda equina. Okay. So even after the termination of the spinal cord, these nerve roots are traversing downward. It resembles the horse's tail. Okay. Only phylum terminal exits up to the coccygeal last bone. Okay. So that is the coda equina. Now coming to the external features of the spinal cord. Okay. We have already mentioned about the external feature, that's the enlargements of the spinal cord. This coda equina we have mentioned, and the external features also have the spinal cord is having some fissures and sulci in relation to the outer external surface of the spinal cord, and they are having relevance. Okay. And anteriorly, the spinal cord reveals a deep anterior median fissure. It is lodging the anterior spinal artery. So anteriorly, we have the spinal cord is divided into two halves by a deep anterior median fissure. It is lodging the anterior spinal arteries passing through the anterior median fissure. And there is a posterior median sulcus, that is also a thin longitudinal groove from which the septum runs in the depth of the spinal cord. I will show you in the diagram. Okay. And each half is subdivided into this. Sulci are dividing the spinal cord in different parts. Okay. And each half is subdivided into anterior, lateral, posterior regions where the anterolateral and posterolateral sulci are there. And the ventral or the motor nerve roots emerge from the anterolateral sulcus. And dorsal or sensory nerve roots enter from the spinal cord from the posterolateral sulcus. So this is the diagram. This is what we have already mentioned. This is the posterior median septum. This is the posterior aspect or the dorsal aspect. This is the anterior aspect or the ventral aspect. Okay. So this is the posterior median septum, and this is the anterior median fissure. And here we can see the central canal. Central canal is the extension of the, in brain we have the fourth ventricle in the in relation to the pons and medulla. It is continuing as its extension as the central canal in the spinal cord. Okay. So when we draw a line connecting the posterior median septum and the anterior median fissure, we can divide the spinal cord into two equal halves. Okay. There is also another sulcus is there that is in relation to the posterior horn of the spinal cord, that is the posterolateral sulcus. And here we have the, both sides we have the posterolateral sulcus. In between this, in correspondence with the posterior horn, we have the posterolateral sulcus. And here also, in correspondence with the ventral horn, we have the anterolateral sulcus. And in between the anterolateral sulcus of the both sides, we have the anterior portion of the spinal cord. And between the two horns, we can see the lateral portion of the spinal cord is there. And the posterior portion of the spinal cord is between the two posterior horns. Okay. Between the two posterolateral sulcus or the two posterior horns, we can see the posterior part of the spinal cord. That's a division. There is a posterior part, there's an anterior part, and the lateral part. Okay. This white matter is called, they are having the anterior column, lateral column, and posterior column. Okay. So, now coming to the internal structure. Internal structure, basically, what is white matter? White matter means it's a collection of axons, and gray matter means it's a collection of nerve cell bodies. That's what we call as gray matter. So, in case of brain, unlike the brain, the spinal cord is having the white matter outside and the gray matter inside. In brain, it's a reverse. That is, a gray matter is outside and white matter is inside in the case of brain. But in spinal cord, this white matter is situated outside the spinal cord. Okay, so nerve fibers lie outside and the gray matter, that is the nerve cell bodies, are seen inside the spinal cord. So, in the center of the spinal cord, we can see the gray matter, which is shaped like an H. Okay, and there is a central canal, which is containing the CSF. So, the gray matter is in the form of H, and with the gray commissure is there. It joins the gray matter on the right and left side. So, right and left sides of the central nervous system, they are connected by commissural fibers. Okay, and anterior and posterior regions, they are connected by means of association fibers. Okay, the largest commissure seen in the this brain is the corpus callosum. This is commissural fibers usually connect the right and left halves of the central nervous system. So there is a gray matter in the form of H with the gray commissure joining the gray matter on the right and left sides. So, and also this gray matter comprises of one posterior horn and one anterior horn on one side. In the entire length, we can see the anterior and posterior horns, but there are lateral horns which are seen only in the thoracic regions. Okay, only this segments, that is in T1 to L2 and S2 to S4 segments, there is an additional lateral horn is seen for the supply of viscera, as well as they are related to the autonomic nervous system, that is the sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow. Okay. And the shape and size of horns also differ in different segments. When we take sections in different levels of the spinal cord, we can see that the shape as well as the size of the horns, that is the shape and size of the anterior and posterior horn, differs when we take sections in different levels of spinal cord. Okay. So, this is the gray matter, which is shaped like an H. This is the anterior commissure. Okay. This is the central canal. This is the anterior horn. And this is the posterior or the sensory horn, dorsal horn. Posterior is always called dorsal part. This is located in the dorsal or the posterior part. This is the anterior part. This is the central canal. Okay. So this is the transverse section of the spinal cord. So as I already mentioned, different sections. These sections are taken at different levels. Okay. And here we can see one thing, that is the shape of the anterior and posterior horns are different in different segments. And in some segments, this anterior horn is prominent, and in some segments, it is shrunken. Okay. This has relevance. What's the relevance of this? So in the third cervical region, we can see this anterior gray column is not so wide as when compared to this cervical region. So this corresponds to the enlargements of the spinal cord, as we have already mentioned. There is an enlargement in the cervical region. There is an enlargement in the thoracic region also. Okay. So here we can see that this anterior horn is much more prominent. In thoracic segments, we have another horn. Okay. Another horn which is called the lateral gray column. Lateral horn is there. Here, when the lateral horn is present, the anterior column is not so so clear. That is not so well developed because it's somewhat like compensatory. And this lateral gray column is in association with the autonomic exit of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so let's examine the let's examine the shape of the horns in different segments of the spinal cord. Okay, so in the cervical segment, it's almost oval in shape. Okay, and the posterior horn is almost slender and the lateral horn is absent in the cervical region. And the anterior horn is also narrow in first 1 to 3 segments and it is broad in the C4 to C8 segments for the supply of upper limbs. The anterior horn has to be much more broader in the C4 to C8 segments. For what? For the supply of upper limbs is also so this anterior horn is usually broader when there is a need for supply to the limbs, upper limbs or lower limbs. Okay. Okay. In the thoracic area also, this is almost circular. The segments are circular in shape and the posterior horn is almost slender and this lateral horn is present in the thoracic region. That is for the thoracolumbar outflow. Thoracolumbar outflow is always called sympathetic outflow. Okay. Craniosacral outflow is always called parasympathetic and sympathetic outflow is always called thoracolumbar outflow. And it is the anterior horn is slender. Wherever there is a lateral horn, then that area, this anterior horn of the spinal cord is almost slender in the T2 to T12 segments and broad in T1 segment, somewhat broader. Okay, in the lumbar region, the posterior horn is somewhat bulbous and lateral horn is present only in the lumbar 1 segment and anterior horn is bulbous for the supply of the lower limbs. And sacral is also circular but somewhat smaller and the posterior horn is thicker and the lateral horn is present in the sacral 2 to 4. That is for the craniosacral. Cranial part is in the brain and the sacral part of the sympathetic outflow. Sorry, parasympathetic outflow is present in the sacral 2 to 4 segments for the sacral outflow of the sympathetic, parasympathetic system. And anterior horn is bulbous for the supply of lower limbs. Okay. So that's all about the different sections of the spinal cord and the relation of the sections with the anterior and posterior horns. Now coming to the clinical correlation. As we have already mentioned, conus medullaris is the lowermost part of the spinal cord. So injury to that particular conus medullaris will lead to the conus medullaris syndrome. And due to injury of S2, that is sacral 2, 3 and 4 segments of the spinal cord, this conus medullaris syndrome occurs. Okay. And the features are basically the anesthesia of the perineum, which is this region is supplied by the sacral 2 to 4 segments of the spinal cord, and also the involvement of bladder and bowel in early S2, S3 and S4 segments carry sacral component of the parasympathetic system, which supplies the bladder and bowel. And sexual functions are also somewhat affected because some amount of sexual function is carried out by this particular S2 to S4 segments. Next is the cauda equina syndrome that is due to the result of damage to the cauda equina. And that will lead to lower motor neuron type of paralysis. Usually, upper motor neurons are associated with the brain and the brain stem, and lower motor neurons, they are associated with the spinal cord. So, any damage to the spinal cord can lead to lower motor neuron type of paralysis in the lower limbs due to the compression of the ventral nerve roots. Why ventral nerve roots? Because ventral nerve roots are associated with the motor system. And root pain is an important symptom due to the involvement of dorsal nerve roots are mainly associated with the sensory component. That is the pain, temperature, touch, etc. That sensory component is carried by the dorsal nerve root. And so root pains in the dorsal nerve roots can cause involvement of the sensory system also. Also, there is bladder and bowel involvement, which is a late presentation. It's not seen in the early stage, but in the late cases, we can see the involvement of the bladder and the bowel in the cauda equina syndrome. Okay. So next is the poliomyelitis. That's also a clinical condition. It's a viral disease, as we all know, which involves the anterior horn cells. Anterior horn cells means it involves the motor system of the spinal cord, leading to flaccid paralysis of the affected segments. And it's also, obviously, it should be a lower motor neuron, which, because it's associated with the spinal cord, it's a lower motor neuron type of paralysis. And if poliomyelitis, it affects the upper cervical segments of the spinal cord, it is fatal because it is affecting the diaphragm, which is involved in the respiration. So, the involvement of C4 segment, which supplies the diaphragm, is fatal in case of poliomyelitis. Next is tabes dorsalis, that is the tertiary stage of syphilis. Okay, this is a degenerative lesion of the dorsal nerve roots. So it is a sensory part is affected, and the posterior white columns are also mainly affected. The sensory side is more affected when the posterior white columns are also involved. And what's the feature of this tabes dorsalis? It's the severe pain in the lower limbs. Lower limbs are mainly affected because of the involvement of fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. Gracilis is mainly associated with it is seen in the posterior column, and it is associated with the lower limbs. Okay, that we'll learn in the further slides. And this feature is severe pain in relation to the lower limbs as the disease occurs in the lower thoracic and lumbosacral segments. And the lower limbs are mainly affected in case of tabes dorsalis. Okay, that's a tertiary stage of syphilis. Okay. So mainly in tabes dorsalis, we can see this is the posterior white column, this is anterior white column, this is the lateral column. Okay, these are all white matter. Okay, this is the gray matter. And posterior white column and the dorsal part is mainly, the sensory part is affected in the poliomyelitis. Sorry, in tabes dorsalis. Okay, myelitis, it's the this paralysis is in the antiventral region is involved in poliomyelitis. So the anterior horn is involved in the poliomyelitis. Now coming to the spinal nerves. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves are there. That is 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Okay, these are the spinal nerves. And the cervical vertebra, they are 33 in number. Okay, 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 4 coccygeal. That's the vertebra. Here we are mentioning about the spinal nerves. And each spinal nerve, it arises by a series of dorsal and ventral. As we have already mentioned, there is a dorsal root, there is a ventral root. Together, they form the trunk of the spinal cord. Okay. And these rootlets unite in or near the intervertebral foramen to form the spinal nerve. Okay. So this is the spinal cord. This is the posterior part. This is the anterior part. This is the dorsal root ganglion. Okay. Dorsal root ganglion. This is the spinal nerve. So ventral rootlet, this is the dorsal root, together form the spinal trunk, and it will ramify. Okay, there is a dorsal ramus and there is a ventral ramus for the, and this ramus is not pure, but these rootlets are pure. That is, posterior will be pure sensory and anterior will be pure motor. Okay, but the ramus, they are not pure. They may contain motor and sensory together. Okay. Now coming to the dorsal root ganglion. So there are different types of neurons, multipolar, unipolar, pseudo-unipolar. Dorsal root ganglion is a type of pseudo-unipolar type of ganglion. Okay. Ganglion are also masses of dissociated gray matter, dissociated cell bodies, that is gray matter, that is seen in relation to central nervous system is called nuclei, and in peripheral nervous system it is called ganglion, but here it is called ganglion because it is associated with the peripheral nerves arising from the spinal cord. They are dissociated areas of gray matter. Okay, collection of cell bodies. That's what we call as ganglion. In central nervous system, such collections are called nuclei. Okay, so as the dorsal rootlets converge, there is a swelling, and the dorsal or the posterior root ganglion, which houses the cell bodies of all the sensory neurons in a particular nerve. Okay, so this is in association with the dorsal root, we can see an enlargement, which is called dorsal root ganglion. Now, typical nerve, this we have already studied. That is a dorsal ramus. It supplies the dorsal 1/3 of the body wall, and the dorsal rami usually do not supply the limbs. Whereas ventral ramus, it supplies the ventral 2/3 of the body wall, including the limbs also. Okay. Now, the spinal segments, the segment or the part of spinal cord to which the pair of dorsal nerve roots and the pair of ventral nerve roots is attached, that is what we call a spinal segment. That's a definition of the spinal segment. In simple words, it is a segment of spinal cord which is containing a single pair of spinal nerves or the two pairs, that is the ventral and dorsal roots on opposite sides. Both sides involved is called spinal segment. Okay. So it's a part of spinal cord to which a pair of dorsal nerve roots, right and left, and a pair of ventral nerve roots is attached is called a spinal segment. And since the length of the spinal cord is smaller than the length of the vertebral column, the spinal segments do not correspond to the vertebral levels. And the spinal segments being shorter lie above the corresponding vertebrae. Okay, this we have already studied in the previous slides. Now coming to the nuclei of the spinal cord. Nuclei, they are seen in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay, so the gray matter of the spinal cord is arranged in three horns. As we all know, there are three horns. That is the anterior horn, the posterior horn, and lateral horn in certain thoracic areas. Certain areas of the spinal cord, there is a lateral horn. It's not always present in every portion of the spinal cord, but in certain areas, there is a additional lateral horn is also present. Okay. So anterior is usually motor and lateral being visceral efferent. That is the lateral portion. Lateral horn is containing both. That is motor and sensory fibers are there in the lateral horn. Whereas the posterior part is purely sensory. Okay. So coming to the nuclei in the anterior gray column of the horn. And the anterior horn is divided into that I will show in the diagram. First I will read and after that I will show in the diagram. Okay. So anterior horn is divided into the ventral part, the head and a dorsal part, that is the base. And the nuclei in the anterior horn innervate the skeletal muscles, and the most prominent neurons are alpha neurons. Alpha motor neurons are most prominent in the anterior motor part. Anterior horn, that is containing more of alpha motor neurons. Alpha, beta and gamma neurons are there according to the size. And alpha motor neurons, usually they supply the extrafusal fibers of the muscle spindle, whereas beta, they supply both. That is extra and intrafusal fibers are supplied by the beta fibers, and gamma fibers are small and they are usually supplying the intrafusal fibers of the muscle spindles. Okay, so let's see the nuclei of the different nuclei present in the different parts of the gray matter in spinal cord. Okay, so this is the anterior horn, this is the posterior horn. So this is the anterior horn and this is the posterior horn. So anterior horn can be more ventrally, it is can be called as the head of the anterior horn. And this part towards the dorsal aspect, it is called the base of the anterior horn. So this part is called more ventrally, it is called head of the anterior horn. And this part beneath that, that is more dorsal, it is called the base of the anterior horn. And the posterior horn is also divided like this. And this part, okay, near the that base, this is called the base of the posterior horn, and above that we can see the neck of the posterior horn, and above that we can see the head of the posterior horn, and the topmost part is called the apex of the posterior horn. Okay, so we have the head here. For the anterior horn, there is a head and base, and for the posterior horn, there is a base, there is a neck, and above that we can see the head, and above that we can see the apex of the posterior horn. Okay, there are different nuclei associated with this two horns and also the lateral. This is the lateral horn. Lateral horn is usually situated in the near to the base of the base part of the anterior horn. Okay, so we can again further we can divide the anterior horn into three parts. This is the medial part, this is the central part, and this is the lateral part. And the medial part is having two nuclei, that is the dorsomedial. This is the more towards the dorsal part, so it is called dorsomedial nucleus. So, just according to this means location, this nuclei are named. This is located more dorsally, so it is called dorsally and medially. So this is the dorsomedial nuclei of the anterior horn, and this is the ventromedial nuclei of the anterior. This part is ventral and this is dorsal, and hence they are named like this. And centrally, that is in the central part of the anterior horn, we have two nuclei basically. The phrenic for the nerves which are supplying the diaphragm, and axillary, that is for the spinal axillary. The spinal component of the axillary nucleus is situated in the anterior horn in the central part. It's called axillary nucleus. And the lateral part, it's mainly supplying this central or the medial part is this nuclei are supplying the trunk and the neck, etc. Okay, and this part, lateral part, it is supplying the limbs. Okay, this is having the lateral part is having the posterolateral part, anterolateral and post-posterolateral nucleus there. So these are the basic nuclei present in the anterior horn of the spinal cord. And now coming to the posterior horn, So before that, we have the intermediate part. This is always called intermediate part, and intermediate part is having two nucleus. One is the intermediolateral. This is the lateral aspect, and hence this nucleus is called intermediolateral nucleus, and this is called intermediomedial nucleus. Okay, so two nucleus are present in the intermediate part of the lateral horn of the gray matter. Okay, and coming to the posterior horn, we have there is a dorsal nucleus. Above that, we can see the nucleus proprius, and above that, we can see the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. There is another substantia gelatinosa that is present around the central canal, that is called substantia gelatinosa centralis, and here we can see the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando, that is seen in the posterior horn of the spinal cord. This is associated with the pain, temperature reception, etc. Okay, and outermost part of the this posterior horn, we can see the postero-marginal nucleus of the spinal cord. Okay, this is also associated with pain, severe pain that is associated with burns, etc. is transmitted to this region, this postero-marginal nucleus of the spinal cord. Usually, this pain that is transmitted to this postero-marginal nucleus is difficult to eradicate. Okay. Also, this horn is not touching the outer surface of the spinal cord, and hence this area between the postero-marginal nucleus and the outer surface of the spinal cord, there is a tract called tract of Lissia. Okay. So these are basically the nuclei of the spinal cord. Okay. So it's simple. We can they can be asked as a short question like that. Okay. So these are basically the nucleus. So you have to write the nucleus present in different parts of the anterior horn, the lateral horn of the intermediate horn, and the posterior horn of the gray matter. Okay. According to position, you have to write. So the cells in the anterior horn, they are arranged in the following three groups. That is, the first is the medial group. It is present toward the entire. So this medial group, that is ventromedial and anteromedial. Sorry, show it the diagram. This nucleus, that is a dorsomedial and ventromedial. That is this nucleus is seen throughout the length of the spinal cord. That is, wherever we take a section, we can see this dorsomedial and ventromedial nuclei present. Okay. So the medial group is present throughout the entire extent of the spinal cord, and it innervates the axial muscles. Axial, that's the muscles in the trunk, neck, etc. Okay, they are innervated by the medial group nuclei. Okay. Now coming to the lateral group. So it is present only in so lateral group is not present in every segment of the spinal cord. It is present only in the cervical and lumbar enlargement, and it supplies the musculature of the limbs. Okay, so that's why it supplies only the musculature of the limbs, and hence it is not present in the throat. It's not present throughout the length of the spinal cord. And it is again subdivided into three groups. That's the anterolateral, that is supplying the proximal muscles of the limbs. That's the shoulder, arm, gluteal region, and the thigh. And the posterolateral supplying intermediate muscles of the limbs. That is the forearm and the leg. And posterolateral. This I have shown. Okay. Sorry. Okay. These are in the lateral part. Anterolateral, posterolateral, posterolateral. Okay. So it supplies the muscles of the limbs, and the posterolateral innervates the distal segment, that is the hand and foot. Okay. So this is the features of this we have already mentioned and shown. These are the features of the spinal cord at various levels. That they are showing that the different nuclei are present at different levels of spinal cord. Okay, only some nucleus like median nucleus are present in every section of the spinal cord. Okay. So central group, it is present only in the upper cervical segments as phrenic nerve nucleus. Okay, phrenic nerve nucleus and the nucleus of the spinal root of the axillary nerve. Now nucleus in the lateral horn. Okay, nuclei in the lateral horn are intermediolateral nucleus. They act as both efferent and afferent nuclear columns. They have both afferent and efferent means sensory and motor columns are there. And the nucleus is seen at two levels. That is from T1 to L2 segments, giving rise to the preganglionic sympathetic fibers. Sympathetic outflow is always called thoracolumbar outflow. Okay, and from S2 to, that is corresponding to the enlargements of the spinal cord and lateral positions of the lateral horn of the spinal cord. From S2 to S4 segments, it is giving rise to preganglionic parasympathetic fibers, chiefly for the pelvic viscera. And at these two levels, the intermediate lateral cell column receives the visceral efferent fibers also. And intermediate medial nucleus, this is mostly internuntial neuronal. Internuntial means interneurons, which are part of reflex arc. Okay, reflex arc you have studied. It will connect this interneurons are short neurons which connect the sensory and motor components and form the reflex arc. Okay. Now, in the posterior gray column, we have different nuclei. The four main afferent nuclei are seen. So, posteromarginal is the outermost, or the towards the outer surface of the spinal cord. We can see the posteromarginal. That is the apex of the posterior horn. We can see the posteromarginal nucleus. It's a thin layer of neurons that caps the posterior horn, and it receives some of the incoming dorsal root fibers are received. Dorsal root means sensory fibers are mainly received from the posteromarginal nucleus. And next is the substantia gelatinosa. That's very important. Substantia gelatinosa, it receives the pain signals, and it's very important when we study the oral surgery. Okay, substantia gelatinosa of spinal cord is very important, and it's found in the tip of the posterior horn through the entire extent of the spinal cord. We can see that is every section wherever we take a section of the spinal cord, we can see the substantia gelatinosa, and it acts as a relay station for the pain and temperature fibers, and it's concerned with the sensory associative mechanism, and its axons it give rise to lateral spinothalamic tract also. Okay, and next is the nucleus proprius. That's a very important nuclei. It's adjacent to the substantia gelatinosa. This is also seen throughout the entire length of the entire extent of the cord, and it is concerned with the sensory associative. That is, these are all nucleus. Which all nucleus associated with the posterior column, they are associated with sensory fibers. Okay, so nucleus dorsalis is also known as thoracic nucleus at the medial part of the base of the posterior horn. It is extending from the C8 to L3 segments. It's a relay nuclear column for reflex or unconscious proprioceptive impulses to the cerebellum. And its axon, it gives rise to the posterior spinocerebellar tract. Different tracts are there, ascending and descending tract. We'll study in later slides. Okay. So, it's a relay nuclear column for the reflex or the unconscious proprioceptive impulses means those reflexes which are getting from the limbs, okay, which are associated with the limbs are called proprioceptive impulses. Now coming to the laminar organization of this in correspondence with the different nuclei of different parts of the gray matter of the spinal cord. This gray matter is divided into different laminas by a particular scientist called Rexon. That is what we call as laminar organization of spinal cord by the Rexon. Okay. So 10 layers of neurons are different neurons are recognized. This is for experimental different experiments related to this laminar organization is conducted. And this is called laminar organization of spinal cord by the Rexon. Okay, they are numbered consecutively by the Roman numeral starting from the tip of the dorsal horn. That is starting from the dorsal horn. That is a dorsal horn and moving ventrally from dorsal to that, from posterior to anterior, it is numbered. Okay, by using Roman numerals. 1 to 6 is seen in the particularly in the posterior horn, and 7 is seen in the lateral part, and rest the 8, 9, and 10 is in relation with the central canal, and 8 and 9 is in relation with the anterior horn. Okay. So, lamina 1, it corresponds to the posteromarginal. That is the apex of the posterior horn correspondence with the lamina 1. Lamina 2, it corresponds to substantia gelatinosa, and 3 and 4, it corresponds to nucleus proprius, and 5 and 6, it is corresponding to the base of the dorsal column. Okay. And 7, it occupies the territory between the dorsal and ventral columns. That's the lateral part, lateral column. Okay. Not lateral column, not lateral part of the gray matter. Okay. And this lamina contains many cells that function as interneurons. Mostly interneurons are there in case of lamina 7. Okay. That is seen in the lateral column. Okay. And 3 clear cell columns are recognized within this lamina, and these are intermediolateral, intermediomedial, and nucleus dorsalis. That is otherwise called nucleus thoracis or the Clark's column. And nucleus dorsalis is present in the medial aspect of the dorsal horn. That I have already shown this. In the medial aspect of the dorsal horn, we can see the nucleus dorsalis. Okay. So, from C8 to L3 segments only, we can see the presence of nucleus dorsalis. And the sacral autonomic nucleus is an inconspicuous column of cells in the lateral part of the lamina 8 in segments S2, S3, and S4. Okay. So 7 is basically seen in the lateral horn. So it is seen associated with the S2 to S4 segments. So this is the laminar organization of the right side. 1 to 6 is basically seen in the posterior horn, and 7 is seen in relation to the lateral horn, and 8 and 9 is in relation to the anterior horn, and in the central part, around the central canal, we can see the lamina 10. Okay. So lamina 7, it corresponds to the ventral horn in the thoracic segments, but at the level of limb enlargements of the spinal cord, it lies on the, because lamina 7 is seen associated with the lateral horn. And 9, it includes the lateral group of nuclei of the ventral horn. And the axons of this neuron leave the spinal cord to supply the striated or skeletal muscles of the limbs. And lamina 10, it surrounds the central canal. It is composed of decussating axons. Decussating means crossing axons. Okay, there are certain crossings in association with different types of tracts. Okay, so it is composed of decussating or the crossing axons and neuroglia. Neuroglia are the supporting cells of the nervous system that we will study in the introductory part, and some neurons in the gray matter surrounding the central canal, and they are having the properties of interneurons. Interneurons means they are connecting neurons between the sensory and motor neurons. They are short neurons which are part of reflex arc. Okay. Now coming to receptors. Receptors are mainly associated with the sensory system and the peripheral endings of the afferent fibers which are coming to the nervous system. That is afferent fibers which receive impulses. So afferent fibers which receive impulses are basically known as receptors. There are different receptors according to their function. First is the exteroreceptors. Exteroreceptors means they respond to stimuli from the external environment. That is the pain, temperature, touch, pressure. They are all collected by the exteroreceptors. Extero means something external. External pain, temperature, the touch sensations, everything is collected by the exteroreceptors. Next is the proprioceptors. Proprioception, as I already mentioned, they are stimuli received from the peripheral appendages or the limbs. Okay. And these respond to stimuli in the deeper tissues, that is a contraction of muscles, movements, position, pressure related to that is basically for the movements and coordination of the limbs. We are having proprioceptors, and they are responsible for the coordination of muscles, maintenance of body posture and equilibrium. And these actions are perceived both at the conscious and unconscious level. That is, when we stand, we are not conscious about how we are standing, how we are having balance or not. We are not concerned. That is the unconscious level of proprioception. Okay, these are all maintained by the use of proprioceptors. And interoreceptors in entero means inside. Okay, enteroreceptors or interoreceptors. They are included as receptor end organs in the walls of visceral. Okay, viscera, gland, blood vessels, specialized structures such as carotid sinus, carotid bodies. They are associated with the blood pressure regulation, like that. Okay, so they are associated with the interoreceptors or the enteroreceptors, and they also carry the sensation of hunger, nausea, pain, etc. are also carried by the intero or enteroreceptors. And next is special sense receptors, that is basically concerned with vision, hearing, that is associated with the special senses. Okay, so these are the 4 types of receptors according to their function. Now coming to the tracts of spinal cord. What are tracts? In simple words, tracts are axons or white matter. Basically, these tracts are having a seamless, a common origin, a common course, and a common termination. And how we name different tracts? The first part of the name of the tract is associated with the point of origin of the tract. Okay. And the second part is concerned with the point of termination. So that's the the naming of or the nomenclature of the tracts. So we have ascending tracts as well as the descending tracts. Descending tracts, they are mainly concerned with the motor system and glands. Okay, motor system. And ascending tracts, they are mainly concerned with the sensory perception. Okay, so ascending tracts means these tracts are coming from the spinal cord, originating from the spinal cord, traversing to the higher centers of the brain. They are ascending tracts of the sensory, they are associated with sensory perception. And from the higher centers, this message is passed to the lower centers of the spinal cord. That they are called descending tracts of the motor system. Okay, so tracts by definition, it's a collection of nerve fibers that connects 2 masses of gray matter within the central nervous system. It's called a tract. Okay, so they are having a common origin, a common cause. These are multiple fibers, multiple nerve fibers having a common origin, a common cause, as well as a common termination. Okay. So they are usually named after the masses of gray matter collected by the origin and termination. First part is origin and second part is the termination. And tracks, the other names, they are called fasciculi, lemnisci. According to the position of the tract, we can name it as fasciculi, lemnisci, etc. Okay. So first we are concerned with the descending tracks. And the descending tracks, they are of two types, pyramidal and extra-pyramidal. Why they are called pyramidal tracks? Why they are called extra-pyramidal tracks? So basically the pyramidal tracks, they are cortico-spinal tracks. Cortico-spinal tracts, by the name itself, we can understand that they are starting from the cortex of the brain and terminating in the spinal cord. So they are called corticospinal tracts. So we have a lateral corticospinal tract which is located in the lateral column and anterior corticospinal tract which is lying in the anterior funiculus or the anterior column. Okay. So these are located in the white matter. Okay, tracts are white matter. So this is called pyramidal tracts. Why this corticospinal tract are called pyramidal tract? Because these tracts, they can be either crossed or uncrossed. Crossed means from higher centers of Earth, maybe, for example, from the right side of brain, some information is passed. Okay, but that information, the response to that particular information, that is maybe most of the times, the the response is muscle contraction. Okay, motor, that is muscle contraction. So muscle contraction is occurring in the opposite side. So right brain is controlling the opposite side or the left part of the body. That is what we call as crossing. So such tracks are called crossing. One part is controlling the opposite side. That is what we call as crossing. And non-crossed or uncrossed means same side, or the ipsilateral part is controlled by the same side of the higher center of the brain. Okay. So in pyramidal tracks, what happens is in the pyramid portion of the medulla, these tracks are crossing and hence they are called pyramidal tracks. And other tracks, they are called extrapyramidal tracks because there is no decussation at the pyramidal part of the medulla is occurring in these tracks. So they are called extrapyramidal tracks. Okay, they are named according to the point of origin. So corticospinal means from the cortex to the spinal cord. Extra rubrospinal means red nucleus to the spinal cord. Medial reticulospinal means from reticular portion of the brain to the spinal cord. Okay. Olivospinal from olive to the spinal cord. Vestibulospinal means from vestibular portion to the spinal cord, and tectospinal means from the midbrain, that is the tectum, to spinal cord. Okay. So from the higher center to the spinal cord, so these are descending tracts and mainly concerned with the motor system. So what is basically pyramidal or corticospinal tracts? They are formed by the axons of the pyramidal cells, predominantly lying in the motor area of the cerebral cortex. And there is some contribution to it from the axons of cells in the premotor and sensory. That is, they are discussing about the higher centers. That is, there are some axons from the cells in the premotor and sensory areas. From here, the fibers cross through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. At the lower level of medulla oblongata, about 80% of the fibers cross to the opposite. That is, decussation is occurring at the lower level in 80% of the fibers. Okay, this is called pyramidal decussation. And these fibers that have crossed enters the lateral column of the white matter of the spinal cord and descends as. So this crossed, when these fibers are crossing at the medulla, pyramidal part of the medulla oblongata, they are descending as lateral corticospinal tract. When this crossing is occurring at the much more lower level, then they are called anterior corticospinal tract because they are exiting via the anterior column of the spinal cord, and lateral corticospinal tract, that is exiting via the lateral portion of the white matter of the spinal cord. Okay. And most of these fibers terminate by synapsing through the internuntial neurons on the anterior horn cells. Okay. So, they will be synapsing through the interneurons at the anterior horn cells. So, from the cerebral cortex, these fibers are coming down, passing through the internal capsule and through the pons, and via the medulla, the pyramidal part of the medulla oblongata, they are crossing. Okay, they are crossing. These crossed fibers are continuing via the lateral corticospinal tract. When they are crossing at a much more lower level, then they are continuing as the anterior. This part, that is anterior corticospinal tract. They are continuing. When they are crossing at a lower level, both are crossing, but when the crossing occurs in not in the medullary part, but much more lower level, then it will be continuing as the anterior corticospinal tract. When this crossing is occurring in the pyramidal part, then it is traversing as a lateral corticospinal tract. Okay. Okay, so 20% of the fibers that do not cross enter the anterior wide column of the spinal cord to form the anterior corticospinal tract. And the fibers of this tract also cross at appropriate levels to reach the gray matter of the opposite half of the spine. Some amount of fibers do not cross, they will continue as such. That you don't have to remember. This is the main point. And the fibers of this tract also cross at appropriate levels to reach the gray matter of the opposite half of the spinal cord and synapse at the internuntial neurons similar to those of lateral corticospinal tract. And thus the cerebral cortex through the lateral and anterior corticospinal tracts, they control the anterior horn. Together they exit via the anterior horn cells. Okay, this because the anterior part of the ventral horn is concerned with the motor perception. Okay, motor system. So they will through the lateral and anterior corticospinal tracts, they control the anterior horn cells of the opposite half of the spinal cord. Okay. So these are basically the descending tracts. They can be divided into pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tract. This column you have to study. That is what's the function of this corticospinal tract, both lateral and anterior corticospinal tract. Their function is in lateral corticospinal tract, this is associated with main motor tract for the skillful voluntary movements, and usually it facilitates the flexors. And usually this crosses in the medulla. Both of them crosses in the medulla. Okay. Also, some crossing is occurring corresponding spinal segment in case of anterior corticospinal tract. And beginning, that's the origin of this corticospinal tract is the motor area of the cortex area number 4, 6. This area is divided, cerebral cortex is divided into different areas and they're having numbered areas. Okay. And termination is in the anterior gray column cells of the alpha motor neurons in anterior horn. Okay. And the extrapyramidal tracts, they are main different tracts are there, rubrospinal. So there are different pathway for the cerebellum and corpus striatum, and they are crossed. So you have to know which of the tracts are crossed and which are uncrossed. Okay. So this is basically the function of this different extrapyramidal tracts and their origin and the termination. Okay. So what's the functional significance of different descending tracts? The cerebral cortex, it controls the voluntary movements of the opposite half of the body via the anterior horn cells, via this type of tracts. Okay. And influence of this tract is supposed to be facilitatory for flexors, it is facilitatory and inhibitory for the extensors. Okay. Now, these are the extrapyramidal tracts. Rubrospinal, medial reticulospinal, lateral reticulospinal, olivospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, and tectospinal tract. So all these descending tracts, they control the voluntary movements of the skeletal muscles of the body through the anterior horn cells directly or through the interneurons or the internuntial neurons. And influence is occurring on both on the alpha and gamma neurons. And also the gamma neurons also affect the alpha neurons through the muscle spindles, and so the all influences finally reach the alpha neurons. So these are the different tracts. In this diagram, we can see the ascending and descending tracts. Okay. So in the anterior column, we have the medial reticulospinal tract. This spinal is ending, then we can assume that is the descending tract. Okay. So olivospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, tectospinal tract, median reticulospinal tract. These are all associated tracts, descending tracts, which is in relation to the anterior column of the spinal cord. In lateral column, we can see lateral corticospinal tract, and anterior corticospinal tract is associated with the anterior column of the spinal cord, and lateral corticospinal tract, it is usually associated with the lateral column of the spinal cord. Okay. Here, the posterior column is mainly concerned with the ascending tracts. So that we will learn in the next slides. So what is ascending tracts? Ascending tracts, we have lateral spinothalamic tract. That is, ascending tracts starts with spinoward. Okay, usually spinoward. And there is an exception, that is fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. they are seen associated with the posterior column of the spinal cord. Okay, gracilis is mainly concerned with the limbs, and fasciculus gracilis is seen in relation to the throughout the spinal cord. Okay, this is seen medially, and cuneatus is seen laterally. Okay, so here we can see the fasciculus. This is the posterior column. This is the fasciculus gracilis, and this here we can see the fasciculus cuneatus. These two are ascending tracts of the spinal cord. They are mainly, this posterior part is concerned with the sensory function. Okay, so the tracts seen in association are usually ascending tracts. So dorsal and posterior one thing we have to notice is that posterior column contains only ascending tracts, but in lateral column we can see both ascending as well as descending tracts, and in anterior column majority is descending tracts, but some amount of ascending tracts are also seen, like spino-olivary tract, etc. Okay, anterior spinothalamic tract are seen in association with the anterior column, which are ascending tracts. But in the posterior part of the spinal cord, we can see only the ascending tracts. So for the sensory pathways, the first neuron. So one thing you have to remember is first order neuron in case of any ascending tract is dorsal root ganglion. First order neuron is dorsal root ganglion in any type of ascending tract. Okay. So for the sensory pathways, the first neuron fibers always start in the dorsal root ganglion, which has pseudo unipolar cells. So this dorsal root ganglion, it has pseudo unipolar means it has a central process that passes the information. So via the peripheral process, the information is carried to the dorsal root ganglion, and from the dorsal root ganglion, via its central root, it is carried to the spinal cord and further passage into the ascending tracts. Okay, so peripheral process of these cells from the sensory fibers of the peripheral nerves, and the central process of the neurons in the dorsal root ganglion, it enters the spinal cord via the dorsal nerve root and terminate either by synapsing in the cells of the posterior gray column of the spinal cord, or a higher level in the medulla oblongata with the cells of nucleus gracilis or nucleus cuneatus. Okay. And after the relay in the nuclei, that is, we have already studied that in the posterior one, there are different nuclei, like posterior marginal nucleus, substantia gelatinosa, etc. There are different. Either they are transmitting, the second order neurons are involved in this substantia gelatinosa, like that, or they may be from the passing the information to the higher centers of the brain. So the central process of the neurons in this dorsal root ganglion enter the spinal cord through the dorsal nerve root and terminate either by synapsing the cells in the posterior gray column of the spinal cord, okay, or at higher levels in the medulla oblongata with the cells of nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. And after the relay in the nuclei, the second neuron fibers start, and from fasciculus cuneatus and gracilis, they are passing the information to the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. And after the relay in the nuclei, the second neuron fibers start and ascend to either thalamus or the cerebellum. And cerebellum finally receives the second neuron fibers, whereas from the thalamus, laid third neuron fibers are projected to the associated sensory areas in the cerebral cortex. So these are the neurons of the sensory tracts. We have to study the first order, second order, and third order neurons. In lateral spinothalamic tract, every ascending tract, the first order neuron is always and always the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, in lateral spinothalamic tract, the second order neurons is located in the substantia gelatinosa, that is located in the posterior horn. Okay, third is the posterolateral ventral nucleus of the thalamus. Okay, and anterior spinothalamic, we have the first order is the dorsal root ganglion, and the second is the nucleus proprius. Okay, third is the same, that is the posterolateral ventral nucleus of the thalamus. It's related to the third order neuron is located in the thalamus. Okay, and fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, they are seen in the posterior column. They are relaying, the second order neurons are located in the nucleus gracilis in the medulla oblongata, and cuneatus, that is the nucleus cuneatus in the medulla oblongata. Okay, third order neurons are same, it is located in the posterolateral ventral nucleus of the thalamus. Okay, and dorsal spinocerebellar, cerebellar tracts, they are concerned with the coordination and balance of the body. Okay, second order neurons are located in the Clark's column, and there are no third order neurons. And ventral spinocerebellar also, the second order is the neurons of the posterior horn. Okay, so this cerebellar tracts, they are associated with balance and coordination, and there are different clinical tests for the assessment of different pathways. Okay. So these are the main ascending tracts in relation to the spinal cord. The lateral spinothalamic, that's axons of the second order neurons, and the function is the pain and temperature from the opposite half of the body is carried via the lateral spinal. So this posterior column pathways or the dorsal pathways, they are more means sorry, the lateral spinothalamic tract, that is the axons of the second order neurons, and their function is pain and temperature from the opposite half of the body. These are crude functions. Then fine touch, that is particular fine touch, etc. Pinpoint sensation are carried by the dorsal column pathways. That is via the fasciculus gracius and cuneatus. Okay, so crude touch, etc. are carried by the anterior and lateral tracts. Okay, so I've already mentioned some ascending tracts are present in the anterior column and the lateral column of the spinal cord. So they can be combined and they can be said as anterolateral column pathways, and the posterior column can be seen named as dorsal column pathways, and dorsal column pathways are more advanced type of sensations, that is pinpoint pain location, etc. 2-point discrimination, etc. are the functions of dorsal column pathways. That is more advanced type of sensations are passing through the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis, that is associated with the posterior column or the dorsal column pathways. Whereas there are some ascending tracts which are present in association with the anterior column and the lateral column. They are more primitive sensation, i.e. crude touch, pressure from they cannot be found as a pinpoint sensation, or more crude or more primitive sensations. They are assessed by anterolateral column pathways. The ascending tracts in relation with the anterolateral columns. Okay, so here we can see this lateral spinothalamic and anterior spinothalamic, they are primitive sensations. They are carry primitive sensations, i.e. pain and temperature. They are very primitive sensations from the opposite half of the body. And proprioception, pinpoint location of pain, etc. They are carried by the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. Okay. Now, another type of tracts are present. They are connecting different segments of the spinal cord. They are called intersegmental tracts. These are formed of the fibers connecting various segments of the spinal cord, and these are present in anterior, posterior, and lateral columns of the white matter adjacent to the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay, spinal cord, and they are usually present in the anterior column, posterior column, lateral column, everything. You can see the intersegmental tracts. Okay. So this is a brief overview of the spinal cord. This is not a complete picture of the spinal cord. There are umpteen amount of tracts are there. You have to study some important tracts I have mentioned. 1 or 2 tracts you have to study in detail. Okay. So every tracts and all we cannot study. So some important tracts are there. This spinothalamic tract, fasciculus gracius, fasciculus cuneatus. These all things you have to study in detail. Okay. Rest of the you can ignore. Just know the origin, function, etc. And this column is enough. Okay. And you can elaborate based on this column when a question is asked. Okay. So this is a very difficult part. So thank you for your patience. Okay. Good night.